Commander Riker teaches Data how to whistle, Armis kills Tasha Yar, and Dr. Pulaski can't save Deanna Troy's child. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Seventh Rule with Cirroc Lofton.
Hello, hello.
My name is Ryan T. Husk, and today we're doing a review of, well, an episode that covers all of those things. It is TNG's Season 2, Episode 22, Shades of Grey, story by Maurice Hurley, teleplay by Maurice Hurley and Richard Manning and Hans Beimler, directed by Rob Bowman. This was July 15th, 1989. Where were you? We've got a very special guest, everybody. Can you believe it? This is going to be a good one. We've got Eric Stillwell joining us all the way from France. What's up, Eric? How are you today?
Hey, it's great to be with you.
Awesome to have you. Also, everybody, very quickly, we do have a very special thanks to give out to Michael C. Bazarewski. Thank you very much, Michael C. Bazarewski, for sponsoring this episode. This guy gets it. We appreciate you. Well, let's just get into it. What's up, Cirroc?
Oh, final episode here.
This is it.
Of this season, and I got a whole bunch of flashback sequences, which is something that I kind of like a lot. But yeah, Eric, this is it, man. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is the season finale. I really have a big question about. For one, this is the 22nd episode, not the 26th, which we would usually expect by now. So this was a shortened season due to the strike that happened, and a little insight on just the kind of problems you ran into because of the strike. I would like to kind of start there.
Well, the season obviously started late because the writer's strike happened at the end of the first season and prolonged the hiatus that we didn't have long hiatuses back then because 26 episodes pretty much took up the full year. But so we did start late on season 2, so we were going to be short 4 episodes to begin with. And then, of course, the studio was hyper focused on budgets. So by the end of the season, they had already spent too much money and the studio wanted to do a clip show. And ironically, it could have been a cliffhanger since Riker was on the verge of death.
Can you imagine if they did? They made a cliffhanger, and then season 3, episode 1 was another clip show. They'd be like, "Oh man, we got you guys so good." But Eric, can you tell us how you originally got the gig to work on Star Trek? Were you a big fan beforehand, and it was just everything you've ever wanted, or did you get stuck with it and you're like, "I don't like Star Trek"? And what was that job?
I was a huge Star Trek fan from my childhood. I think as early as 9, I started watching reruns of the original series in the early 1970s. I was only 3 when the original series started, but by the early 70s, I was old enough to appreciate it. A friend of mine introduced me to it, and I became a huge fan. And even when the local station, I lived in Idaho because my dad was in the Air Force. We were stationed at Mountain Home Air Force Base. And the local station in Boise took the show off the air for the summer and put Perry Mason reruns on. So my friends and I started a signature campaign and sent a petition into the TV station, and they promised us they would bring it back in the fall, which they did. And they also sent me some pretty cool, black and white PR photos of Kirk and Spock. So I was a huge fan. And by the late 70s, I was involved in Star Trek fandom. And I was involved with the International Star Trek Club called Starfleet. And I became the president of the organization.
Wow.
And it kind of grew like really exponentially in the early 80s because of the movies coming out. So that's how I originally had some contacts at the studio, because Gene Roddenberry and his assistant Susan were honorary members of the club. And when I found out that they were going to do Next Generation, I immediately like sent in my resume. I worked on this one TV production filmed up in Oregon, which was called Promise, with James Garner and James Woods, and it was a Hallmark Hall of Fame TV movie, which ended up winning like the most awards ever in the history of television for a TV movie. It also had Piper Laurie in it, who recently passed away, and she won an Emmy for that TV movie, and it won a Humanitas Award and all sorts of awards, Emmys up the wazoo. So anyway, I had this resume with just that one project on it, and I sent it in to Susan Sackett, who passed it along to Eddie Milkus, who passed it along to Bob Justman, and eventually I got called in for an interview. But I didn't get the job from the interview because they ended up
plot twist.
Well, they hired two people who had already worked at the studio in some capacity, like mailroom or tour guide, whatever. So I thought, well, then I'm going to go to Hollywood and get a job as a tour guide at Paramount Pictures. And so I did. And then a couple of months later, one of the original PAs got promoted, David Takamura. He got promoted to post-production. And I had run into Bob Justman at the first screening of the pilot episode, Encounter at Farpoint, which they had screened for the cast and crew at one of the theaters on the lot. And Bob saw, I was hired by I was a tour guide at the studio, and my boss had asked me one day if I wanted to do door duty at this screening that they were doing for Star Trek. I'm like, sure. Because the cool thing was, after you check everyone into the theater, you can stay and watch it. So I got to see the pilot episode along with the cast and crew, and Bob Justman remembered me. And literally like a day or two days later, he called me and said, "Are you still interested in working on Star Trek? Because we have an opening." And I went into his office, and I actually said something, the dumbest thing I've ever said in my life. I thought, well, normally, we're supposed to give like 2 weeks notice if you're going to quit your job. And Bob yelled out to his assistant, Carol Eisner, he's like, "Carol, bring in the stack of resumes for this position." And it was like, 2 feet thick. And he's like, "If you don't want the job, there's a lot." I'm like, "Okay, I'm ready. Start tomorrow, 6 a.m.
That's hilarious.
Wow.
I was a production assistant for the first 2 seasons, and towards the end of the second season, I don't remember exactly when, but I became the script coordinator for the series.
So, first of all, I have to admire your determination there, Eric, because you literally took a gamble and said, "I'm going to pick up and move to Hollywood and just try to get a job as a tour guide to hopefully one day get in at Star Trek." So that was a total gamble, as much as you can probably gamble in life.
It's pretty unbelievable, yeah.
And how great is it that it actually worked too?
It did.
You made it happen.
I have to admire that.
I still pinch myself when I think back, because it just seems almost impossible that would happen.
So,
wow.
Fast forward a bit, you're working on the show for a couple years. Then, towards the end of the second year, somebody taps on your shoulder and says, "Hey, Eric, I got a job for you. I hope you don't have any weekend plans." Or what? How did that go? What was the job?
I was trying to remember exactly who it was, if it was Maurice Hurley or if it was Rick Berman. I think it was Rick Berman, because he had very specific assignment for me. It was the last episode. They were doing this clip show. It was Maurice Hurley's last episode before he left, and he had written this basically skeleton outline for the show that I guess originally Rob Bowman thought he was going to have 5 days instead of the normal 7 days to shoot this outline, but they only gave him 3 days to do it
Wow.
to save money. And so Rick Berman said, we need to fill a bunch of gaps with clips from the first 47 episodes. Believe it or not, 47 is always showing up in Star Trek.
Yes, it
There
is.
were 47 episodes prior to Shades of Grey. So I had to literally go to an edit bay over in the post-production department with a library of 47 episodes of Next Generation on 3/4 VHS tape, and I had to screen all of the episodes, create basically a catalog of scenes that could be memories that Riker would have. So it was mostly Riker scenes from all the different episodes, and I had to go through and then also categorize them into like certain types of emotion, like fear, anger, love, sexuality, whatever category it would fall into. And that project took me 80 hours in 1 week, in 5 days, basically, 80 hours. And it was exhausting, but Rick wanted to have all these clips because I had to basically list the time code of each scene from each episode and where it started, where it ended, so he could just go and look at these scenes and then pick the ones that they wanted to use as Riker's dreams during the sequences that are used in the episode. But that was a pretty overwhelming assignment, but I managed to pull it off.
Wow. Yeah, I bet you wish you had like a Blu-ray player or some kind of Paramount Plus account. Would have really helped
that's what I was thinking.
But so you bring up a lot of things, and these names kind of float around, and we've been watching this show now for 2 seasons, and some of the names that keep popping up are, for us, Maurice Hurley and Rob Bowman, and you brought up the fact that Maurice was his kind of last hoorah for the Next Generation. Can you give us a little bit about Maurice Hurley and just give us some insight about his character, about his work ethic, or just whatever offhand stories you might have? And also, Rob Bowman is somebody that we want to pry into because a lot of his directing style has become really a signature storytelling for Next Generation, and we've been real fans of his throughout the course of watching this first 2 seasons. So just a little insight on how those men work and the kind of passion that they have for the show.
Well, Rob Bowman was one of the youngest directors that they had used on the show, and he was very friendly, nice, easygoing guy. I was a production assistant during most of that time, but I was assigned mostly to working with the writing staff over in the Hart building. Back in the day, in the first season, we were actually in a trailer in the middle of the backlot. Trailer, okay. I think it was trailer 24. So that's where I was stationed for my little errands all over the lot all the time. So I didn't get to really spend that much time with Bob or Rob Bowman, but I remember getting his lunch a few times. That was one of my jobs. And then Maurice...
Oh, that's better than eating his lunch.
They called him Rob Chicken Salad Bowman.
And Maurice Hurley was the showrunner, head writer, basically, under Gene Roddenberry at the time. And I had more interactions with him because one of the ones I most distinctly remember was at the end of the first season, right before when the writer's strike was starting up. They weren't supposed to be writing. And they were doing the Neutral Zone, which was this episode with some Romulan characters. And I remember Maurice Hurley coming into the production trailer, and he basically did stand over my shoulder, and he's like, "Eric, I have an assignment for you. I need some names for some Romulan characters." But they all knew I was a Star Trek fan, so it was like they would come and ask me these crazy questions, and he's like, "I need a name for a couple of Romulan characters in the script that we're doing." And I was so naive back then. I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? Just make up some names? He's like, no, look them up in a Romulan encyclopedia. So I got to make up the names for the two Romulans in the neutral zone, and so I think every now and then, they would ask me for these little Star Trek-ish things if they got stuck. And Morris was a nice guy, but I know that I don't think he was particularly happy. It wasn't easy working with Gene's notes on a lot of the scripts, because Gene had very specific ideas about how he wanted to do things in it, and so it wasn't like Maurice could just do anything he wanted. At one point in time, he wanted to buy a spec script that I wrote, and I had written it during the writer's strike when we were off for so many months. I had to go back to Oregon and stay with my parents until the strike was over, and then come back to Hollywood. And I wrote this spec script called Shattered Time, which was basically an analogy of sort of like the Star Wars weapon defense program that was going on back in the 80s. And Maurice liked the script, and he showed it to Sam Friedel, who was the production manager, and Sam loved it. And apparently he showed it to one of the studio executives, Tim Isofano, and they were all telling me how much they loved my script and they wanted to buy it. And I was thinking, oh my God, this is actually happening. And then, of course, Gene nixed it. He didn't like it.
Damn.
Which really sort of sucked, because Gene was always my idol as a kid growing up, and because he was the creator of Star Trek, and then he was the one who put the silver bullet through my heart.
But there is a happy ending to this story. Everybody at home, Eric did sell 2 story ideas, one to Next Generation, one to Voyager. I think the Voyager one maybe was like first season, 9th episode, right around there.
Yeah.
And the Next Generation one that he did pitch that did well was yesterday's Enterprise, which is a very beloved episode coming up in the 3rd season. So there's definitely a happy ending there. Eric, can you tell us, though, a regular day on the set of Star Trek or in the back lot of Paramount, say season 2, and was there ever a moment where you actually walked onto the bridge of the Enterprise and thought, wow, this is it. I'm actually here on this bridge?
Well, as a production assistant, my primary role was delivering memos and script revisions to studio executives and to the set and whatever department. So I had a bike, and there was only one other production assistant, Heidi, who was a friend of mine, also from Oregon. And we ran all around the lot delivering stuff day in and day out. Some of the weird highlights of being a production assistant was I also had to go collect petty cash envelopes for the actors from the studio cashier's office. And Marina was one of the ones who got petty cash because they would get like facials and stuff on the weekends because of all the makeup and everything.
Right.
And she'd always be like, Eric, where's my petty cash? I was always terrified of Marina, because she was always, the only reason she was ever looking for me was she wanted her petty cash. So and I would pick up lunches, deliver lunches. So as one of the 2 PAs, I sort of started focusing more on running errands for the writing department, because the other PA wanted to do more set stuff and makeup and hair and wardrobe and all that. So I did a lot of work with running the scripts back and forth to the print shop. I mean, it's so weird talking about it now, because now the print shop probably doesn't even exist because everything's just emailed out to people. But
right.
Back then, we actually had physical hard copies of every script and all the different colored revisions and pages constantly going back and forth. And so that's how I became more involved with the writing staff. And eventually, one of the the script coordinator who was assigned to the show had gone on a medical leave of absence, and she just never came back, and we never heard from her. Nobody knew what happened to her.
Wow.
And the woman who was basically the script typist who was doing the job for quite a while, a shelf fell on her face. Just a shelf that was above her typewriter just fell down one day and broke her nose, and she had to leave, and she was hospitalized for a while, and and suddenly I was thrust into like doing the script coordinator's job and keeping that department running. And by the beginning of the third season, I had actually been given the job of script coordinator, and Maurice Hurley had left. And before Michael Piller started, they had another showrunner come in named Michael Wagner, and he was just overwhelmed with the job because there weren't any scripts, and he finally just quit. And Michael Piller was like the runner-up candidate, so they called him back in, and he eventually took the job. But during this gap between showrunners, I would be going over to Rick Berman's office every day and taking his script notes and going back and doing the changes and working with the script typist. And that's how I became the script coordinator on the show.
Wow, it's bedlam.
It was yeah. I mean, so many crazy things happened. Like in the first season, I started during the 13th episode of the first season, which is just around the time that the whole staff was changing because of the issues that happened with DC Fontana and you know, the original writing staff who were all going out the door, and I was coming in, and it was very political and weird feeling. So for me, I was kind of like thinking, I always dreamed of working on Star Trek, and you know, it's all about this great reality of people working together, and it was sort of like the whole opposite thing going on in real life. But on the days that I had to run stuff down to the set and visit the sets and go on the bridge, the thing that used to stop me in my tracks really was between the sound stages, you could look up in the hills and see the Hollywood sign, and I'd be like, wow, I can't believe I'm here in Hollywood, you know, running my ass off, but I have this like dream job, and it was pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, Star Trek is really one of the few, if not the only, franchise that the fans of it are actually the ones that are writing the stories or helping to create these stories. You mentioned coming up with character names, and you know, you weren't even a writer at that point officially, and here you are being asked to give us some, you know, Romulan names. So, and we've seen this kind of thing happen over and over again, where people who are involved with the show are also fans, and then they end up becoming part of the tapestry. And I think that's one of the remarkable things of it. What are some of the, you know, the good memories that you had when you were on the show? Like, as far as, what was the thing that you just couldn't believe that you were there seeing? Was it the set? Was it the bridge of the Enterprise? Or was it being in the back room discussions and seeing how, you know, the soup is made?
Well, it was always cool to be on the sets, because the sets were pretty amazing. I mean, especially Deep Space Nine, the sets were pretty mind-boggling, especially the promenade, because you feel like you're really on a space station.
Yes.
And on the Enterprise, especially in the corridors where you can't see the end or the beginning of, you feel like you're really on a spaceship. But so I loved all those things, but there was always a catch-22 to everything in my experience. Like, because I was a fan and people found out I was a Star Trek fan, people would always be coming up to me and asking me, how much could you get for this prop? I'm like, I don't know, really, honestly.
You're like, but I'll take it off your hands for $15 right now.
This was before eBay, everybody.
One time they were filming one of the movies the original cast movies. I think it was Star Trek V, and I heard a news report that the sets had been broken into, and someone stole the captain's chair from the original Enterprise set and some of the costumes. And then I found out that Harv Bennett's office had called Gene Roddenberry's office to find out if I still worked at the studio, like basically accusing me of being a suspect. Wow. It was always shit like that was disappointing to me because I loved Star Trek so much, but I would never steal anything or sell the props. And then when we did yesterday's Enterprise, I spent a little more time down on the sets because I wanted to watch them filming our episode, and the situation occurred on 10 Forward where Whoopi Goldberg wanted to change one of the lines in her dialogue, and someone said, "Oh, well, here's one of the writers," and I'm like, "Oh no,
nice!
Don't talk to me, though. Talk to Rick Berman. You got to talk to Rick Berman." So I was, polite and told her I would let the production office know that she wanted to talk to Rick about a line change. So I called David Livingston and I told him, and then the next thing I find out is Rick is furious because what is Eric Stillwell doing on the set? Why is he talking to Whoopi Goldberg? And then I just noticed that I've been banned from the set. And I'm like, why is this happening to me? I was doing everything right.
You're like, I love Star Trek. Why is Star Trek being mean to me?
And I was doing everything the way it should be. I was making sure that the message got passed along. I didn't promise to do anything for her. And anyway, it was always something, the ups and downs of it all. Yeah. But the funny thing about
you were a scapegoat. You were a scapegoat in a lot of situations.
I mean, that's what PAs are a lot of times, though.
Well, I don't know, Cirroc, if you remember Richard Arnold.
I do.
He was jealous of any other fan who worked there, so he was always trying to undermine me and get me in trouble for stuff, and it was just so frustrating. And
the more things change, the more they stay the same with fandom around here, because the fans can be pretty cutthroat. Eric, we only have you for another minute here, but I think you're finishing up a thought there.
I wanted to say something about Shades of Grey because they asked me what should we call this episode, and I said I think we should call it Riker's Brain.
That's hilarious
because all the fans know that Spock's Brain is one of the most unpopular episodes, and we knew this clip was going to be horrible. Although I did get my very first screen credit as a researcher at the end of the show. But they kind of found out about the Spock's Brain thing and said we can't call it Riker's Brain, and so I said, well, how about Shades of Grey, because there's no black and white to this episode. It's just this weird hodgepodge, and that's how it got the name.
And history was made. Well, Eric, this has been so much fun having you. Super excited that we got the chance to talk with you, and really appreciate that you took the time way out in France. It's like 2 a.m. for you practically over there. But anyway, we do hope to have you again soon sometime, Eric. Absolutely.
Yes. Absolutely. I've heard a lot of good things. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard a lot of good things about that.
And tell Denise Crosby she's got to co-host that one.
All right.
Oh, we are harassing. She's not going to get out of it. You watch. But anyway, thank you very much, Eric. We really appreciate you taking the time with us. It's been amazing meeting you. Everybody at home, stick around. We're going to cover this glorious episode a bit more on the other side. We'll be right back on The Seventh Rule.